Hey, so in the Bible passage Lauren just read, there's a lot of running around at the beginning. Did you guys notice that? People are just running back and forth all over the place. The women are running, the disciples are running, one even outrunning the other, but all of them at one point or another, they stop running. They stop running. And what causes them to stop? The empty tomb. The tomb that once contained the very dead body of Jesus was no longer occupied. That's what stopped them from all this running. You know, this morning I want to invite all of us to stop at the empty tomb, just like Peter and John did. Not literally, of course, but I'd like to invite us to stop and think and really consider what the empty tomb means. You'll notice that in the passage it says that Mary Magdalene found that the stone covering the entrance of Jesus' tomb was removed. Now, I have, for most of my life, have always thought that the stone was removed so that the risen Jesus could get out. Is that what you thought too? That the stone was removed so Jesus could get out. But if you ever read other accounts of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances in the Bible, you'll notice that he never needed a door. He never needed a door. He would enter places without using the entrance. You know, in Luke's account, while the disciples were in a room alone, Jesus suddenly appeared and then he ate fish right in front of them. You know, Jesus post-resurrection, although very much flesh and bone and not a ghost, didn't need a door to get in or get out. Therefore, the stone covering the entrance of Jesus' tomb wasn't rolled away so that Jesus could get out, because he didn't need it to be rolled away. He could just walk through it. What we find out is that the stone was rolled away not for Jesus, but for me and you. But for me and you. It was so that we, like the disciples, could come in and see. To see that it was no longer occupied. To see and to consider the fact that its former occupant was no longer dead, but had risen. And that's the invitation for you this morning. Regardless if you've been a believer for decades or if you're just getting to know what Christianity is. The invitation this morning is to come and see. And consider that the reason that Jesus' tomb is empty is because he's no longer dead. He is risen. And if he indeed is raised from the dead, then consider how that changes everything. Consider how that changes everything for the world and for you. Because if the tomb is empty, because Jesus rose, then what the Christian faith offers to you and to me and to the world is nothing less than the greatest hope and the greatest life in all the world. And this is something I believe everybody needs to hear. If Christ rose, then it means we have the greatest hope and the greatest life. It doesn't take a genius to see that the world is harsh and hard. You know, we watch the news and it just seems like every country is at war at one degree or another. That in every city and town in this country, people of all kinds suffer some sort of injustice, either systematic or personal, often both. And just take a look at your own lives. Just think about your own lives. Individually and personally, there's sickness, there's stress, there's tragedy, there's brokenness, there's sin, there's death. Now, I'm not saying all this to depress you, but to point you to what the resurrection of Jesus means. And the Bible mentions that one day God will bring about a new heaven and a new earth, a restored Eden, a restored paradise, in which heaven and earth will be reunited, and God will make his dwelling among people once again. And all these things, and all those things I mentioned, you know, all the sickness, all the death, they're going to be wiped away. There will be no more war. There will be no more sickness, no more evil, no more injustice, no more separation, no more suffering, no more death. You know, the great characteristic of this new world that's coming is the absence of death. The absence of death. And what the resurrection of Jesus is, it's a glimmer. It's a glimmer. It's a preview. It's a glimpse of what is about to come. In the Bible, the risen Jesus is called the firstborn from among the dead, meaning Jesus' resurrection, his overcoming of death, is a preview, a precursor of death's final overthrow when the new heaven and the new earth come. That all the awfulness, imagine that, all the awfulness, all the evil, all the brokenness, all the death we see in today's world will come to a final and dramatic end. And it's all because with Jesus' resurrection, when Jesus rose from the dead, death, the ultimate result of evil and sin, for the first time was totally upended. Now you may be asking, wait, weren't there other resurrections before Jesus? Doesn't even the Bible mention that people like the Sidonian widow's wife, the Sidonian widow's son, and Lazarus, who was, and Lazarus, weren't they resurrected before Jesus? What makes Jesus' resurrection so special then? If it's happened before. Well, it's as one pastor put it, no one had ever or has ever risen like Jesus. No one has ever risen like Jesus. Well, when the other people rose, Lazarus or the Sidonian widow's son, they were pretty much super resuscitations. I can't speak today. Resuscitations. Unlike Jesus, they needed help out of their grave clothes. They needed to be unwrapped. They needed to be helped out of the tomb. And eventually, think about it, Lazarus and all the other people that were raised before Jesus, all of them eventually got old, got sick again, and died. But Jesus, he didn't need to be helped out of the tomb. He didn't need to be helped out. And in our passage, the cloth and the linen he was wrapped in, they were all separated and organized. And when Jesus resurrected, he stayed. He stayed resurrected. He lives. Death was totally overcome. And as Jesus is, so will all of us who believe in him, we will be the same when the new heaven and the new earth come. In Jesus' resurrection, there is hope, a certain hope, that all things that plague us and cause so much brokenness and suffering, it all will one day end. And life will never end. The greatest life, the greatest hope is ours today. Now, this leads me to tell you about the greatest yet most uncomfortable thing for many people about Jesus' resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus means, everything I mentioned, the greatest life, the greatest hope, but it also means that he is Lord. That he is Lord. And that the only way to get this hope, to get this life, is for you and me to have him as Lord. To have him as Lord. The resurrection sets Jesus apart from all other great religious leaders and founders. All great teachers and all religious founders, of all the major religions, from the Buddha all the way to Muhammad, they were all clear on one thing. They were not God. You read the writings, or you read the stories of the Buddha, you read the writings of Muhammad, and they will make this one common claim. They were not God. None of them claimed to be God. When people would ask them, how do you find God then? They would always say, follow my teaching. Read what I wrote. Hear what I say. I have a path. I have a teaching for you on how to find God. But Jesus, he was different. When people would come to him and ask him, how do you find God? Jesus didn't point to a teaching. He didn't point to a doctrine. He didn't point to a story. He didn't point to certain rituals that you had to do. He pointed to himself. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Other religious teachers and founders, they present paths, they present ways, they present teachings on how to get to God and how to have life. But Jesus, he claimed to be God, and he claimed to be the very life that everybody looks for. Jesus was more than just a great religious founder. He claimed to be Lord. He claimed to be God. And you think about everything he says, everything he said about himself, only God can make claims, the claims that Jesus made. You see, as the Bible shows, there was no one, check this out. No one was more humble than Jesus. No one was more humble than Jesus. No one was more gentle than Jesus. He welcomed children, and he associated with the lowest of the low in his society. But although he was humble, and no one was more humble than him, he was not modest. He was not modest at all. He was humble, but he was not modest. When it came to being God, when anybody asked, hey, are you the one? Are you the Messiah? Are you God? He just says, guilty. You found me. When it came to being God, Jesus did not shy away from accepting worship. He forgave sin, something only God can do. He claimed to have been around when Abraham lived, and that was thousands of years before Jesus lived, or at least when Jesus was on earth. Jesus made claims, and he assumed prerogatives and said things that only God could. Normally, if such a person came around and he made claims and did things like Jesus, we would either peg that person to either be a pathological liar or incredibly, incredibly insane. But Jesus is neither. He is neither because of the resurrection. Tim Keller put it this way: if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all that he said. If Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept everything he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about anything that he said? The issue on which everything hangs on is not whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he rose from the dead. You see, with other great teachers, other great religious founders, you can decide whether you like their teachings or not. You can choose to like some of what they teach, and you can ignore the rest. But with Jesus, his resurrection makes it impossible for you to ignore everything he said. It makes it impossible for you to ignore anything he said or claimed. You can't pick or choose with him. If he didn't rise, you can treat him like any other religious leader or any religious thinker or teacher there. You could say, oh, I like the, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I like that. Hey, you know what? I like how he says, love your enemies. That's great. But that part where he says, whoever doesn't lose their life and dies to self is not worthy to follow me. And those parts where he says you got to hate your father and mother in order to be worthy of me. Those teachings. You know what? I can ignore that. But you know what? He's now alive. He rose from the dead. You can't ignore any of that. Jesus says that the only way to God, the only way to life is not any teaching, but it's all in him personally. It's by believing in him and what he did for you on the cross, dying in your place, suffering the wrath of God for your sin and your shortcomings, and then rising from the dead to overcome death for you, that you will receive all the hope, all the life God offers you. And the ultimate proof that Jesus is everything he said he was, Lord, God, the only way, it's the resurrection. The fact that the tomb is empty, that he lives today. When you accept that he rose from the grave, when you have him as Lord, then you receive the greatest life, the greatest hope in all the world. You receive a consistency and strength to live this life regardless of how hard this life and how hard this world can be. Consider the earliest followers of Jesus. Many of them, including 11 out of the 12 original apostles, all suffered and even died for their faith in Jesus. History records that many of them were crucified, many of them were fed to lions, many of them were stoned, thrown off buildings, and beheaded. All because of their faith in Jesus. Now, how and where do they find the strength and power to endure and remain steadfast even to the point of death? It was all because they had Jesus as Lord. It was because they were absolutely absolutely convinced that he was alive. And because he lived, they knew they would live too. Even if they were put to death, because Jesus' resurrection proved that death would no longer have the final say. Death would no longer be a temporary state, and whatever they lost in this world, even their physical bodies, it would be all given back to them in the new heaven and the new earth, as it was for Jesus. This strength, this hope, this life is available to you. It all comes down to whether you see Jesus as Lord or not. You know, the passage Lauren read from John 20 was written as a historical report. It's not a legend. It's not a made-up story. It was written as a factual historical report. It contains details. No one was trying to, let me say this. It was written. It contains details that no one who was just trying to make things up would even think of including. You know, one being the fact that the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were women. You know, back then, back in Jesus' day, in that patriarchal, male-dominated society, no one would ever dream of making women as the main characters or the first witnesses of anything important happening. Because, you know, women back then were seen as a little bit more than property. A woman's testimony wasn't even admissible in legal court back then. Yet the gospel records that it was women who saw Jesus. And you know why? Because they did. That's the only reason why the writer of the gospel would include that women were the first witnesses, was because they did see him. And all of this was recorded so that you would believe that Jesus lives. And the resurrection was for real, and that Jesus is really Lord. So that you can have all the hope and all the life that nothing can overcome, including death. You know, consider the empty tomb. Consider the empty tomb. You know, we started this talk by asking ourselves to consider the empty tomb, to walk in and see. So to wrap it all up, consider the empty tomb. Throughout history, many people have tried to explain that its emptiness was due to the disciples stealing the body, or was due to some sort of elaborate conspiracy or hoax. But I invite you to consider the evidence that the emptiness of the tomb was due to nothing less than resurrection. Consider this. Consider this. At least this one point of evidence. Christians have lost track of Jesus' tomb. Nobody really knows where his tomb is anymore. Yeah, I know that there are 2 or 3 sites in Jerusalem that people say is Jesus' tomb, but none of them have been proven to be, you know, totally authentic. The fact of the matter is that the early Christians lost track of the tomb. And why is that? Well, let me explain it to you this way. You know, when you have a loved one, let's say, you know, we all have loved ones, right? And when we have a loved one who's still alive and who's still in our lives and we have them, we care less about what they actually have. You know? We think twice about their room. I mean, if it's a child, you know, as long as you have them there, you know, the only thing you think about in regards to their room is whether it's clean or not, right? But other than that, you don't care about, you know, their room, you don't care about what they own. But then once that loved one is taken away, once they pass away, then everything they have becomes sacred to you, right? You start caring about what's inside their room. In fact, I know people who've lost loved ones, and they have kept the room of their deceased loved one the same for years. And it's sacred. Even the very buttons of their shirt or their sweater become sacred objects to them because their loved one, they don't have their loved one anymore. The first Christians lost track of the tomb. They didn't see the need of making the tomb a sacred place. Because why? Because they had Jesus. He was alive. He was alive and well. They did not see the need to remember where the tomb was because they had Jesus. He was risen. He was alive. He was Lord. And so why keep track of what was in the past when what was in front of them was Jesus, their risen Lord? They had Jesus. Now, do you have Jesus?